the introductory remarks. Welcome again to the CRC Roundtable, our monthly virtual seminar series. If you haven't been here before, our intention is to host targeted, inclusive, and informed conversations that match scientific advances and management needs. The websites are designed for contribution, not consumption. And as a reflection of that intent, the panelists have been given about 25 minutes total to make some introductory remarks, allowing 30 minutes for facilitated discussion, and I'll be doing that out of the chat. This is all about us, giving us a place to ask clumsy questions and sort of practice bravery and humility that's necessary for moving forward. We always begin these roundtables by answering the question, why this topic at this time by these speakers. And so this follows December's roundtable conversation that really focused on behavioral change campaigns and tools to make them more effective, recognizing that the easy things have been done and our challenge now is a non-point one, and that the on-the-ground actions of 18 million residents of the watershed are the key to success. But as we explored those tools, we began to suspect that there was theory and depth underneath them, and that we were being fairly naive in understanding the potential of social science to contribute to the effort. And I think this feeling was confirmed when I actually read the report on a study that Lisa and Dan, two of our speakers, will talk about. They deployed a survey asking for respondents' understanding of what integration of social science into the Chesapeake Bay program could do. And their main finding was that many of the program members across all levels of the organization were certainly interested in seeing social science research applied to forwarding the goals of the watershed agreement. But their understanding of how social science can do so is or was incomplete and is incomplete. And so the majority of the respondents kind of saw social science primarily in terms of promoting public behavior change. And that's really what the December roundtable looked at. But that perspective differed from that of the social science respondents, who saw their disciplines as tools to systematically evaluate individual business and institutional incentives and behaviors. And so they started to highlight many, many opportunities. And so this month's conversation explores really how to go to that next level and incorporate a social science lens into environmental management work more broadly. Our speakers are going to provide insights about their experiences, some avenues for future improvement, and some success stories. So in, I think, order of appearance, I'll just briefly introduce them. Daniel Reed is an environmental anthropologist. I love that discipline. And Daniel seeks to really describe how people view, act towards, and are affected by environmental policy. And that really allows us to develop programs that are grounded in people's lived experience, which I think is really important. Lisa Wanger is a longtime and trusted colleague. She's a professor of environmental economics at UMCES. She's very talented at integrating ecological and economic analysis tools to look at costs, benefits, and risk of restoration and protection. Both her and Daniel have collaborated on a study that they're going to talk about today. Wes Eaton is a rural sociologist. He's an assistant professor with the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming. So he's speaking us from Wyoming. Daniel is speaking to us from India, where it's now apparently almost 11 p.m. So kudos to him for staying awake. Wes's work is in collaborative and community stakeholder-driven approaches to managing complex environmental problems. So I'm really, really excited to turn the floor over to them and try to if we can collectively sort of go to the next depth about something we've been talking about a long time, integrating social science into the restoration effort. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Daniel and Lisa, who will be going first.
Thanks, Denise. I'm just getting my slides up here. See if we can get things to work properly. There we go. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Denise. You set us up well. And just to be clear, this project was aimed at, how could we be using social science better to achieve our goals in the Chesapeake Bay Partnership? And hopefully folks on the call are the kind of folks who want to engage in that conversation, because we'd love your insights. So let's just dive on in. This project had three main goals: was to evaluate the use of and attitudes towards social science application in the Chesapeake Bay Partnership, and Denise covered that a bit for us. Thank you. The second one was hopefully through our products increase understanding of social science theories, applications, and the evidence of effectiveness. And then really this talk is part of the third goal, which is advance a dialogue about strategies, how we could enhance social science capacity. This slide is really just telling you one important thing. The project is complete at this point. We've and the methods we use to generate the findings that you're about to hear are literature reviews, questionnaires and interviews with the partners, and then some analysis and write-ups. And when we say, and this is who was represented in our questionnaire and interviews, so I want folks to understand where these conclusions are coming from. So you can see that we had representation across all the goal implementation teams, and I hope folks on the call are familiar with that setup, where folks are tasked with different aspects of the restoration, but also quite a lot of folks from leadership, modeling, and managers. The interviews were 20 self-selected folks who, if they answered the questionnaire, you were given the opportunity to say, I have more to say. And then there were also 10 key informants identified by our project managers, Casey Wetzel and Amy Handon. So because we've been giving this talk to a lot of high-level managers, we've front-loaded all the findings and recommendations so that you can really start wrapping your head around it right from the beginning. But as the talk progresses, we'll get into more evidence and details about what we mean by these points. But the quick overview of our main findings and recommendations, there's plenty more details in the report, but this is the overview. As Denise said, there's broad support for using social science, but not really a full understanding of all the ways in which it might be used. And the key recommendation from there is just to build more social science literacy and capacity so that folks will know how to use social science, even if they aren't social scientists. And the program has funded quite a bit of social science, and I really hope the talk doesn't come across as negative, in that we know a lot of folks are doing great and difficult work, but we are focused on what we could improve. So we are mostly going to talk about issues that we found, as opposed to how great things are going. And what we saw was that of the behavioral science, there wasn't a lot of tracking of how well things were working. And so the recommendation would be to track it more. And the reason that's important is because these recipes of how to change behavior, these theories, are really still an emerging science. And we don't really have a good handle on how to transfer good results in one case study to another case study. So when you track the evidence, you're building the evidence base. We see a lot of opportunities to use social science in other aspects of adaptive management besides just forwarding specific goals that have already been set. And so that's a really broad conversation that we're going to get into a bit more, but there are just many tools in the social science toolbox that could address problems that folks are having achieving goals. And then we did hear a bit from the partnership that they saw a lack of sort of strategic thinking about, where should we invest in social science and how can we be most effective in this integration? And so the recommendation would be to take some time and think about how to use it most effectively and which investments are likely to pay off and potentially scale. So we're going to talk a bit about behavioral interventions, and I just want to make sure folks know what we mean by that. So behavioral intervention is an approach used to encourage a behavior change, usually in a specific community, and or can be used in an organization too. But what makes it a social science application is if you've designed it to anticipate and counteract known decision-making biases that we all have. We all have cognitive limitations in how we decide what to do that's in our best interest. And when it doesn't match up what we do versus what we intended, we call that a bias. And probably many of you have experienced this particular descriptive social norm nudge on your power bill, where you get compared to your neighbors. And the bias that's being used there is that we want to be normal. We want to be like our peers. And so by comparing you to your neighbors, they can change your energy use. And that's been shown to be fairly effective. Okay, so now we looked at all these behavioral interventions that had been applied in the Chesapeake Bay Partnership. And well, not all of them that had been applied. Sorry, that's a bit of an overstatement. Ones that had been funded through the partnership that we could find out information about. And what we saw in this pie chart shows you is that about 60% weren't even trying to track how successful their intervention was. It is difficult to do, so that's not understandable. But there are two aspects to that. They're not, if outcomes aren't being measured, and if projects aren't identifying behavioral theory, which we also found to be very common, it's kind of hard to make sense of your results. You know, you see some positives, you see some negatives. Is that what you should expect given the situation, or are you underperforming, overperforming? You don't even know. So we think there's a lot to be gained by tracking the evidence. And just so you don't think behavioral theory is just some academic exercise, Dan's now going to explain why theory can be so important. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So I'm just going to go through a quick case study that we came across when we were going through some of the behavioral interventions that we reviewed for our study. And this one centers on a project by the Lancaster Farmland Trust, who set out with the goal of increasing agricultural BMP adoption amongst Mennonite farmers, who tend to be more conservative regarding the use of new technologies and practices. But rather than starting from scratch, the Lancaster Farmland Trust used theory to design their outreach strategy. And in particular, they applied a theory called diffusion of innovations, which is one of the better cited theories in the social sciences. Among other things, diffusion of innovations highlights that there are particular characteristics of the potential adopters, their peer networks, and the innovations, which are BMPs in this case, that influence how likely people are to adopt it. And so Lancaster Farmland Trust knew that their audience was quite conservative. And so they started by building trust and collaborating with a few leaders in the community who were open to adopting BMPs. And these leaders then became spokespeople for the project, who both informed their peers about the BMPs and then gave feedback to Lancaster Farmland Trust about how best to conduct outreach with the community. Part of that outreach involved kind of the typical demonstrations and farm visits to show how BMPs can be advantageous over current farming practices and yet are compatible with farmers' goals. But the real benefit of that trust building and collaboration came when the community leaders they were working with suggested that Lancaster Farmland Trust conduct their outreach through what's called the Mennonite Hotline. The Mennonite Hotline is a phone conference line that Mennonite and other Plain Sect people use to dial in and stay connected with the community. By conducting their advertising, doing their advertising for their programs through that platform, Lancaster Farmland Trust was able to reach out to the community in an effective and appropriate way. And by the end of their project, they had installed 32 BMPs on 4 farms and designed 1,675 linear feet of stream restoration in a community that many practitioners had considered unreachable. And so this was possible because their outreach strategy was built on theory, that Lisa discussed, the behavioral theory about why people do certain things that allowed them to build on what other people had already done rather than starting from scratch. And they took the time to listen and build trust with the community. And that latter point, I'm going to pass it back to Lisa, and she'll pick that up as we talk more about the need for adaptive management and strategic planning.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, and it's just so key to know, and they've added to the evidence base now of this theory had not been used in a plain sight community to our knowledge. And so now we have this understanding that this can work in the plain sight community. So it just keeps adding to the evidence base. All right, let's see if I can make the slides go. Where am I going? There we go. So now I'm going to mush up two of our findings and recommendations in the interest of time. They do overlap. A lot of people talked about a need for strategic planning and adaptive management. You know, are we really going after the right things? Are we spending our time in the best ways? And I think these quotes help us understand what some of the challenges are. People have their favorite tool and are reticent to put time and energy into doing it differently, despite the evidence of the same outcomes in response to the same types of outreach. And this was in an agricultural context. And so the opportunity here is that if you're not getting a good response from your existing tool, there are plenty of social scientists who probably already know a lot about why the program's not working. And it may not be the reason people think. And so really going in and being receptive to hearing from folks can really open up new insights. And I think Wes may touch on that a bit too in his upcoming talk. Next point, I feel we get random acts of restoration as opposed to taking a step back and seeing where our effort would have the greatest impact. So there were various aspects of this comment of, say, take, for example, the behavioral work has been predominantly done with homeowners, not exclusively, but so you can imagine that even if you were wildly successful at reaching a good number of homeowners, you might ask the question, you know, is that the best way to use resources to reduce nutrients or whatever it is people are trying to do, create habitat? Or are there people who, once we change their behavior, have a huge impact? And so those are some of the questions we're raising. And, you know, we don't have all the answers, just wondering if that should be a focus, thinking strategically about that sort of thing. And then finally, at a more institutional level, we heard the WIPs and the TMDL just take up so much energy that it's really hard to get the management board to care or do something about all the other outcomes. And so there is an adaptive management plan within the program, but so much of it goes through the management board that they are really overburdened with the need to adapt and manage. And so that raises the question of, could a different institutional structure support progress on other goals? So the report lays out a lot of potential suggestions, and you know, it really comes down to, we need more resources, we need more investment, but not everything's going to get done at once. So we decided to just highlight what we thought might be some priorities, and of course, we'd love your feedback. That one could take some initial steps towards social science integration, creating learning opportunities, and I think the devil's in the details there, where we're not just describing case studies, but we're really explaining how the social science was used and could work. And I also think this is where Wes's talk is going to have a lot of insights too. And then we could take some baby steps towards strategic planning, if not a more comprehensive approach. There's some potential for increasing social science effectiveness by building on those theories that we talked about and by gathering more evidence, because we just really need to understand what are the important context variables that determine success of a behavioral intervention. It's really not well understood. And then just really recognize that social science and practitioners have a lot to contribute to adaptive management. If we are willing to have these conversations about not just how do we get this goal done as quickly as possible, but could we take a step back and look at, is this the right objective? Is there another objective that's more compatible with multiple goals? That could be a very valuable conversation. And then also from an institutional point of view, are we making use of all the great actors we have in the watershed? Are we leveraging the capacities and spreading the work among trusted partners? And I think that would be a pretty easy step to take. And I'll just share with you that you can download the full report. And we have many people to thank, including our co-author, Erica Blair. And we had various advisors from the Chesapeake Bay program who are not responsible for anything, but helped us out a great deal. And then, of course, we're happy that Amy Handon and Casey Wetzel were our project managers.
Thank you, Lisa and Dan, and thanks for being so succinct. I'll just let people know that when you will have access to all these resources will be in the email that goes out to anyone who registered, along with the link to the recording. And also that the CRC newsletter that's called Streamline in 2 weeks follows up on this table and will add additional resources to that. So there'll be lots of opportunities. And with that, I'll ask Wes to take the floor.
Hi, all. So I think this project I want to share really takes off with how do you do social science research in partnership with many stakeholders, but I want to focus in here on doing social science in partnership with practitioners. And that's about building relationships across frontline practitioners and a range of social scientists. And I'll introduce that through this project I've been a part of called Advancing Engagement. So the idea here was I was working with some folks in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but also in the Platte River of Nebraska and Verde Valley on a project called Water for Agriculture, where we wanted to understand the impact of stakeholder engagement for solving complex problems. Through that project, I realized there was a lot of people nationally and internationally that were interested in the science of stakeholder engagement to address complex natural resource issues, including water. And so we developed this what ended up being a workshop series. This was a USDA-funded conference grant that originally was going to be an in-person 3-day workshop, but because of COVID, we were able to we went virtual. A little bit intimidating because there was well over 100 people who registered and wanted to participate. Wasn't sure how to handle that on Zoom. One of our keys of making that successful was bringing in a team of professional facilitators. And ultimately doing this virtually allowed for this inclusive and then iterative and flexible participation. I'm going to talk about how that project went and share some insights on how do you organize a network internationally around questions of research and practice, and how do you do that together. So here's some of the shared definitions that our group was grappling with and putting into work. I just wanted to put that up there, so when I use these terms, this is what we mean by these things. I think the idea of knowledge co-production is central to the questions Lisa was just talking about doing social science successfully means building a shared understanding and incorporating multiple ways of knowledge when you're working on complex issues that involve a range of stakeholders, the Chesapeake Bay, different water and ag stakeholders who have different values and interests. And then working towards transdisciplinarity means not just working across disciplines, but with folks that have science knowledge beyond science. And that's successful when we have an openness to building a common understanding that allows us to reassess our values. And that's, I think that's the key to doing social science successfully with multiple partners, is being open to learning together. So what we wanted to do with this project was build a new network of researchers and practitioners that can learn together and also develop scholarship together for our second goal, and then together to co-produce a research agenda for stakeholder engagement and working landscapes. I'm going to talk mostly about that first project goal today and some lessons about researcher-practitioner relationships that we learned together. So who was involved? This project ultimately had over 160 international participants. We had both early and late career academics, practitioners, including professionals with government and environmental groups, extension, folks affiliated with indigenous groups, USDA, and then private firms and consultants. And then importantly, then if we're talking about researchers and practitioners, how were researchers and practitioners represented, and how did we define that in our network? And you can see here from our survey that folks who conduct academic research high percentage of those that said that was what they were doing most of the time. And then facilitating engagement as a practitioner. So these may be the same people wearing a different hat at different parts of their job. You can see the portions of those folks who related to that. And this was an important conversation within this group because no one wanted to be pigeonholed as either or, but really emphasizing the parts of their work that they do that had a research side or more of a practice-based side. So I'm just going to highlight here some of the products. Again, was building this ongoing network, and then a special issue, which we'll share the link for later. That's being published in this practice research journal, and then also our research agenda, which has 6 different themes and several sub-themes, which will also be shared. So here's kind of the meat of it. How do you bring together this large group of people with different interests and different perspectives on practice and research to co-produce something together? You can see from here, we first started with our convening group, our organizing team that solicited the call. Over 180 responses of people sent in things that they'd like to do. We took that information, we designed our first workshop, and this paralleled a series of write shops to produce that scholarship together. That first workshop, people wanted to emphasize questions of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and stakeholder engagement to address water and other natural resource issues. We then moved into working groups and ultimately to the products that we're talking about today. So I'm happy to share more about that process, but this was what was designed by our facilitation teams on how can you co-produce knowledge together across these different participants. Okay, let's get to some of the big stuff that researchers and practitioners had to say about the question of integrating practice and research. The big takeaways from practitioners is they wanted to understand that the experiential knowledge they have needs to be valued. They wanted to see research that was linked to practical problems, and it sounds like Lisa's giving some examples of that. They want to improve science communication and not get caught up in the jargon, and involve practitioners throughout the research process. That means involving researchers from the beginning in terms of what the research question is and why and who should be involved in that, and then interpreting and sharing those findings. Scientists, what they were offering was they want to structure values scholarly over the structure that they're working with, and values scholarship over those practical outcomes. And so they're emphasizing some of the barriers here, that the science they're doing is slower than practical needs, but they offered that maybe sharing and learning about these constraints together and motivations across these groups would be a good start for building that dialogue and working together. So we had facilitated activities on what practitioners wish researchers knew and what researchers wish practitioners knew across this large group. And this is the focus on what practitioners want researchers to grapple with and want to grapple with together. Practitioners want to focus on real world impact. They want us to do research where people already are. They want to bring the research and the activities to where people are coming together versus having people come to them. They highlighted that failure is very important and something they feel that science can overlook, how to pull back the curtain and how to learn from that. They want to incorporate research that incorporates the real world actual barriers that people struggle with, time, resources, and money. They stress that the slow pace of science isn't in itself an impediment for working across research and practice if that focus of the work together isn't just on the scientific product alone, but building in trust and relationships across these groups. They wanted to be recognized for having their own limitations as practitioners. They emphasized doing research in partnership with practitioners, but also the communities practitioners are part of, the producers and ranchers and landowners, as opposed to research that is extractive and just takes and produces results for academia, but doesn't come back to the community, which is that last point, bringing that research back to the community. Again, researchers, they emphasize the institutional barriers. And the big key takeaway was this need for a shared vision for doing and studying engagement. And the product that came out of that was this research agenda, which again, I can share offline. We need to know how research can help practice. Researchers, they wanted to actually understand, well, how do we actually work with practitioners to do this? How can we accommodate their time and their motivations? And what are the problems they want to see? How can researchers help practitioners track outcomes? That was an issue that Lisa was bringing up. How do we know the evidence, and how can we develop an evidence base in partnership with practitioners? Practitioners would like the ways they'd like to see collaboration happen. The groups would like to see an honest comparison of their own goals and motivations around and working here in the world of water resource management. And also, researchers wanted to know that the stereotypes about always being extractive are not true. Not all researchers are just taking, and those are the ones that are wearing both hats. So some of the cross-cutting themes is understanding this is really about collapsing the divide between knowledge users and knowledge producers as another way to make sense of the research practice gap. Appreciate the research process role rather than identity. So many bringing in more people to participate in that role as doing research. Conceptualizing research to practice, not as separate things, but as ends of the shared continuum. And that listening is an intentional practice that's critical for all, and understanding what those reward systems look like. I want to close with a couple quick resources. So how do you do this well as a scientist? There's some fascinating literature that our group was engaging with. This is just one list that comes from work by Jenny Cross's team out of Colorado State on what are the characteristics of a participatory scientist? What are the individual characteristics that work well when a scientist is working with practitioners and stakeholders? And there's some things along this that work well. Some other resources are collaborative capacities and research on that. And I want to leave us with this skill that our team talked about. We talked about this with the Water for Ag project, and then this team of practitioners and researchers talked about an individual characteristic for success and working across disciplinary boundaries, including research and practice, is something that Myra Strober has written about called the doubting game versus the believing game. The doubting game is this main skill set we learn in academia. A serious scholar begins by asking questions and starting with doubt and allowing a new idea to be worthy only if it overcomes this negative opposition. But when social scientists are working with practitioners and working across disciplinary boundaries, another approach is instead to try the believing game, which you try on these new ideas, and that you start with belief in order to accomplish understanding of the different perspectives. So you have an adversarial versus a cooperative, ferreting out error versus unearthing truth approach. And this is an individual level skill that we talked about across both practitioners and researchers. And I have some resources that we'll share later. I also want to thank the folks that have helped bring this project together.
Oh, thank you, Wes, and thank you to all our panelists. That was just wonderful. So just to remind the attendees, we are facilitating questions out of the chat. And actually, I'm going to start with one that kind of a request from our panelist, which was, could you enter in the chat any example that you've seen of a researcher practitioner network that worked really well, and or if you might be able to contribute in the chat examples from either that researcher or practitioner standpoint, ideas about how social science could be integrated into the work to elevate it. So I'd like you, if the panelists have done a wonderful job, if you can sort of respond in the chat to those two requests by them. And I will also wait for some questions, but I'll go ahead and ask one first. And I guess all panelists, if you could take a crack at this, have you seen an example where this has been done really well? So like for Wes, I'm particularly struck by, I think I've been playing the doubting game a lot. And I love the idea of the believing game, right? But does an example come to mind for you where you've seen an example of when people approach it as the believing game, to kind of give some, I don't know, give us a little bit of granularity to what that might look like?
Well, I think in the Water for Ag project, we had natural scientists, biophysical scientists, and social scientists working with these new stakeholder groups we formed in different parts of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in Potter County and Mifflin County. And I think being in the room of those stakeholder deliberations on what the problem was and what the solution was, it would be easy to walk into that situation already having predetermine what the problem was and saying, well, clearly the problem here is the ag use and the runoff into the water and the numbers we're getting out of the streams and the way that's accumulating downstream. But our job was to hold off on predetermining what that problem was and instead foster a space for people to listen, but also consider new resources. And we were successful in one example is that the conservation district had lots of data, but usually that was kind of going in some groups' ears in one ear and out the other. But because we changed the setting and provided an equal sharing of information and time, people became open to learning and to listening about that. So holding off on predetermining what the problem was and instead creating that listening environment allowed for learning and which was documented in terms of how people, what they learned, new information, what do they change their existing way of seeing the problem.
Mm-hmm.
I want to elaborate on an example that Larry Sanford put into the chat since I was involved in the Oyster Futures project. And there was a case, I think that was a believing game issue as well, because we had experienced facilitators who had success with fisheries management in the past, but really it was just, we came in and we said, let's see what we can make of this. It was a collaborative modeling focus. And I think the thing that was really critical to generating trust among the diverse partners, which included, watermen, that's what we call the fishers in the Chesapeake Bay, the NGOs, the government agencies at the state and federal level, it was that we really were very receptive to all suggestions. We didn't say, oh, well, we know what you watermen think isn't true. We said, okay, you think this is true. Let's go research it and see if we can put it into the model. And we were just extremely receptive and open-minded. And they were so shocked, honestly, to finally be listened to, that it was a very positive experience all around. So, and I would invite Dan to talk about, I think Dan has done some work that's more on the doubting game, looking at what aspects of ag outreach have really been effective. And maybe Dan would like to elaborate on some of his recent research.
Yeah, so we had been doing some work in the Chesapeake watershed, trying to do some behavioral interventions with practitioners, and ran into a lot of the issues that Wes was describing about different timescales that researchers and practitioners work on, and different institutional constraints that we're under. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't think we solved all of those problems, but we did kind of work way forward with some other folks on our project team to kind of adapt the intervention we were hoping to test that ended up being effective. And so we had tried to do something in the field where we were working with practitioners to track their interactions with farmers, and we ended up using an online platform, placing ads in an online farming magazine instead. And that was a lot of back and forth with practitioners about what's working for them and what's not, and just kind of being open to that exchange of ideas and whatnot. I did see there was another example in the chat. I don't know if people want to, apologies if I'm butchering your name, Sia, but had an example.
Before we move to that, I just want to amplify one other aspect of Dan's work. So we worked together on this, did a meta-analysis trying to look at, of all the stuff that's been tried among ag BMP adoption, both in the science and the outreach, what has really consistently been effective. And honestly, we were a little shocked by the results. financial incentives were the number one thing. And then the other interesting insight that came out of that work was that peer networks that I think we all believe are very important for sharing information. Dan's work suggested that that was more important after a farmer had actually already decided to adopt a practice and implementing it effectively and maintaining it and consistently, as opposed to the initial adoption, which it's not like that meta-analysis is the last word on the subject, but it was pretty interesting that we didn't find as much commonality across studies as we expected.
Oh, thanks. That was great. This maybe is a question for you, Lisa, to start off, and then if anyone else can chime in. But I was really interested in the in your study to talk about. I mean, we talked about utilizing social science in adaptive management, and it's usually done at this level of implementation programs, like getting farmers to adopt BMPs. We don't usually talk about it at higher levels in the program, like what would it take to really reevaluate our goals and outcomes? Like, do we have the appropriate goals and outcomes that are represent really what's sustainable and doable for the future? I mean, can you talk about the hard nut of integrating social science theory and ideas into adaptive management at higher levels of the program?
Yeah, I have there's two things in the report that I think would be useful. One is the fact that a lot of social scientists just feel pretty siloed, right? That, oh, you're going to go work on engagement issues, and they don't really see it as a true science. And certainly there's very little understanding of institutional social science, which is where we look at, are incentives compatible, and do we have the right relationships to work on common problems? So there's that issue of there's actually quite a bit of knowledge, but it's not getting elevated to the manager decision-making level. And then I think the other issue is I'm not sure folks really understand the potential benefits. And we highlighted this case study that NIH really heavily engaged in using social science in their how they funded research into medicine. And they just feel like they got so much out of it. And they particularly highlighted their environmental health issues with children program as having benefited quite a bit from integrating social science. And so they kind of are at the extreme of what if you really went all in, what benefits would you get? And what they found, and they had to do this iteratively over time. It didn't work. They had a strategic plan. It didn't work at first. They had to keep iterating. And one of the things they discovered is you have to have someone who really understands the social science with access to the high level decision makers, the program director, because otherwise it just keeps staying in that silo and people just really don't understand the potential ways you can use it. But a lot of it comes down to institutional incentives too. I think that's the key take home is, are we really thinking about, are people who we are asking to collaborate benefit? And that's where those networks, I mean, there's also examples of networking, say with the environmental educators that again is highlighted in the report, where they found a lot of benefit to just discussing with each other, what they were doing and did they share common goals and could they work together?
Wes and Dan, you don't have to comment, but if you have anything to add.
Well, lots of these questions are really big picture and structural, and I think that's important. There's some ideas there, but I do want to share just like some micro examples of what can be called social learning or learning together happened between the social scientists in the Water for Ag project, and then not with the practitioners, but with the stakeholder partners. And one example was just what can a model do and what can't a model do? What can a mail survey tell us and what can't a mail survey tell us? And we had the time and the resources to have those conversations with people who were motivated and provided resources to participate in these monthly stakeholder meetings, like again in the 2 places in Pennsylvania, for example, where we shared some mail survey data, and folks on this call helped create some short 2-page or 4-page summaries of what that was. And then we were able to have that conversation in the room about what does it mean to have a sample population? What does it mean to actually have these findings? One of the key things that I learned from that was the conversation in the room changed from, well, I think people here think this, to now we have actually data on what people in the community see as concerns. And importantly, we surveyed both agricultural producers and then non-ag residential in the same counties. And we were able to see where their convergence was. And what the people in the stakeholder groups really took away was how much they both felt a sense of responsibility for protecting water resources, when earlier the conversation was, we do this, they don't care. And it changed from, they to a we type of conversation. So that was a groundswell level. I also appreciate these bigger structural questions about integrating social science. Maybe a first step with bringing social science back to these big goals is having a broader discussion with a range of people and getting different reflections on what other goals that there might not be, given the massive amount of resources and capabilities there are for the potential to meet a range of goals.
Thank you. Dan?
I'll just briefly tie a couple of threads together between what Lisa said and what Wes had said, is that I think one of the quotes Lisa had shared during the presentation, and if not, it's in the report, was about how people have their idea of what works and what motivates people, and they kind of stick to that path. And as Lisa was pointing out, a lot of times there's an institutional incentive behind doing that. We just get into this habit and the institutions drive us in one way. And that kind of leads us towards that doubting game that Wes was talking about. And so the real question is, how do you incentivize and design institutions that kind of open that up to trying things out more collaboratively and adapting your institution and coming at it from more of an open perspective. And so there's that kind of relationship between how do we structure those incentives to bring in that kind of mindset that Wes was talking about that's so helpful for collaboration.
Thanks, Dan. You're really cruising at 11 p.m. in India. It's a great synthesis.
I am fading.
Hey, I did want to combine a couple questions and there's a ton of questions in the chat. And just to remind people that if we don't get to ask them during this time frame, we forward them to the panelist and get their responses and then share that. So have no fear if we don't get to your question. There's a couple questions about really social science literacy. And it started out as how do you increase that across the Bay Program partnership? But I think you can interpret it more broadly with a question that says, especially when you're working with a lot of natural scientists. So how do you sort of give them language to work with and at least a place where you can start to have that conversation and thought about how to integrate social science? So how about I'll go the other way around. Dan, if you want to start, and then Lisa and then Wes, about ideas about that, educating people.
Yeah, I think there was a comment in the chat there about how some people have had the experience of having biophysical scientists come to them and just ask them, how do I get people to do the thing that I want them to do? We heard some of that as well from our respondents. And there is an element of social science that can help with that. But I think what we're trying to bring in is more of a sense that is kind of a self-questioning and opening yourself up to other perspectives. And so it's not just about the idea, the goal has been set, how do we get there? But let's think about that goal, where that goal comes from, who decided upon that. And maybe through those kinds of questionings, we can bring something together that's a little bit more collaborative and more, different kinds of solutions will emerge from that. That's kind of a broad level of how I will go about that, but I'll pass it off to Lisa and Wes, who maybe have something more specific.
Yeah, those are critical points, Dan. I'll go micro since you went macro. I do think, and I think this reflects something Wes said too, we need to be telling really accurate stories about what we've tried. Did it work? Did it not? What theories do we base it on? and not just come out and tell these rah-rah stories like it was great and we did this, and not really dig into here's the science that was applied, here are the questions that remain. I think that's the devil of the details of how we share knowledge about social science and practice.
Yeah, I'd second both those. Really happy to see that that focus in your report on, well, we did these things, but here's opportunities to reflect back on what our basic theory of change was, and how do we know the evidence for that this is changing. And I think that leads to the question of how do you build the capacity to collect that kind of data and use it. I think the reason that doesn't happen is because that becomes useful for the researchers, but not for the practitioners. So I think that the link is, how can the exercise of collecting some data from some engagement this practitioner did with this, let's say this agricultural group, how did that result in something? The bringing that data back to the community to see and make sense of the findings itself can not just generate better social science, but it can be generative of the trust and relationship building that I think is at the core of this. So maybe seeing and exploring the potential for social science as a tool for relationship building and trust on individual and group and different geographic levels, and talking about it as such and showing how it might be, as opposed to fixating on the scholarly outcomes.
And if I could just build on that, I also think we're not really engaging our social scientists in the broader community as effectively as we could. And so if we had these shared goals that were co-developed with a lot of social scientists and not just the biophysical scientists saying, well, here's what we need from the social scientists, I think that is also key to building making better use of our existing social scientists.
Larry Sanford has a question. What about social science on the structure and effectiveness of the Chesapeake Bay program bureaucracy itself? This is a big question, Larry. How to get the program to reduce its focus on the TMDL and WIPs. You had a comment about that, and elevate the importance of other goals. And I think that's really speaking to, people really are in this track, the public's in a track, and there's a recognition that really we got into this game for a bigger goal that started out as sort of a shared one, but we seem to have gotten a little lost. So like maybe just the first part of Larry's question is there a way to evaluate the effectiveness and the structure of a bureaucracy itself and how that's working for the effort, and how to make recommendations on how that might need to pivot? A big date is coming up, right? 2025. So Lisa, I know you have to leave shortly, but do you want to?
I do, yeah. But I will just say we have addressed that questions very specifically in the report. So, and we give an example of an institutional evaluation that was done of the NOAA RISA program, the regional science, whatever RISA stands for. And so I think there's probably some lessons learned in that institutional science. But then we also interviewed people in the partnership who do management evaluation, and they also had some very interesting insights. So I don't have time to get into it, but I just will absolutely say there's a whole science of institutional social science that looks at how to align incentives, is usually one way it's said, but there are other aspects as well. Like I would even question this issue of, we don't know yet that we want to put less emphasis on the TMDLs. We just know that we're not achieving all our goals, right? So we should go in very open-minded of what's going to generate the most good here. So that's my 2 cents.
Oh, thanks. Wes and Dan, any comments about that?
Just to build on what Lisa said, I know she had to take off a little bit early. So part of the questionnaire that we actually designed, we looked at some of the scholarship on organizational effectiveness, and some of our questions were actually based on that scholarship that we asked people about. And those were questions about, well, I have a host organization, and then I also work with Chesapeake Bay program? How well do those things align? Are the resources adequate for me to complete, work on both of those tasks? Do I feel that I have ability to propose and receive support for new ideas? And so all of those things were built from scholarship that's been done on what makes an organization effective. And so there is a literature out there that could be useful for the kind of project Larry was talking about. It, of course, will require a lot more social science research into the Chesapeake Bay program and how it works in order to make more specific recommendations. Our scope was more limited, so we didn't look for, specifically how do we make this more effective. We were more interested in the broad contours of social science integration.
Thank you.
Larry, fascinated by your question, and it makes me think about some of the maybe it could be called some of the foundational conditions of a collaboration, some social science indicators of the diversity of people who feel that their views are being reflected, that they feel a sense of responsibility, that they feel their voices being listened to within the organization. And J.R. Buckle here on a chat alluded to what is the makeup of the folks that are decision makers and motivated to give their time to be part of this. So I think kind of a probably happening. I'm not familiar with this, but some kind of an assessment in terms of questions. And I think the metrics would fall under social learning as is that happening within the group, as opposed to, as Denise or someone or Lisa was saying, we need different goals in team deals or whatever. We have to ask how those goals got elevated and maybe what other perspectives there could be, and ultimately build on the existing capacity of the group, as opposed to saying we need to change or leave this behind. I'd sure like to think more about that and share some resources that came out of our Water for Ag project on that kind of question. Thanks for asking it, Larry.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to give in the, to basically give the panelists a chance for some sort of parting remarks and maybe ask them to answer a question and give us a parting remark, which is there's this really interesting idea of what would the perfect ratio of social scientists to physical scientists be? So maybe if you could just say if you could wave a magic wand, what the ratio would be, and what would you like, the audience to leave with, basically as a thought from today. So I'll let Dan go first.
I'm going to dodge your question on ratios, Denise, because I think that's going to depend completely on the context of whatever problem you're dealing with, and it might operate at different scales and be different over time. But I think the parting thought that came from our report and that I want to emphasize is that there's a really unique opportunity here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. There's a great network of practitioners. There's social scientists all over the place doing great work. And I think if we can just bring them together, using some of the resources that Wes was talking about, I think there's great opportunity to make great leaps in how we're doing restoration and making sure it's just and equitable and meeting the goals of the diverse community within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so I just want to leave with a note of momentum going forward, that I know 2025 is really scary, but there's a lot of good work that we can do here. So thanks everybody for participating in this.
Thanks, Dan. Wes, you have the parting comment.
Wouldn't it be novel if we had little pods, a practitioner, a social scientist, and a behavioral scientist, and a biophysical scientist coming together with a stakeholder and brainstorming, collectively understanding what a problem was and sharing what their disciplinary expertise would say is a way to move forward, and then vet that with a broader group? I think that would be innovative.
Great. And Wes, do you have a parting? Something you'd like us all to remember?
Play the believing game, maybe.
That's a very good one. So I want to thank our panelists, Lisa in absentia, but Wes and Daniel, thanks for a really, really wonderful hour. And Daniel, well, both of you for being willing to be remote. And thank you all for attending and paying attention to Macon's. We will be following up with a link and answers to the questions that didn't have an opportunity to get asked, and join us on Wednesday, March 15th for the next roundtable. Thank you all.
Thank you all.